The Bogosity Podcast, early and ad-free. Become a subscriber at Patreon, Subscribestar, or Discord. Use the links at donate.bogosity.tv.
Welcome to the Bogosity Podcast for the week of August 25, 2024. The podcast that tries to understand the New York Times effect on man. This is your host, Shane Killian. Next Saturday is the 5th Saturday in the month. That means no podcast next week. We'll be back in 2 weeks. Now let's hypothesize the news of the bogus. And another data point on how we can't trust government in general and the Biden administration in particular, with Biden and Kamala Harris bragging about all the jobs they've created, which we already knew were just lost jobs from COVID being recovered, and not entirely at that. Now, the Bureau of Labor Statistics has admitted that the payrolls were overstated by 818,000, the second worst revision in U.S. history. The worst was 2009 with 824,000. It follows an adjustment from December 2022 when the BLS overstated payrolls by 1.1 million. The later discrepancy was first noted by Zero Hedge back in March, who reported, "Here we go again. Only this time, the BLS had overstated payrolls by 800,000 through December 2023, and more if we were to extend the data series into 2024. It's truly statistically remarkable how every time the data error is in favor of a stronger, if fake, economy. It also means that, far from the stellar 230K average monthly increase in payrolls in 2023, which the White House would spin time and again as direct evidence of the benefits of Bidenomics, the true average monthly payroll increase in 2023 was only 130K. The BLS recently announced their Current Employment Statistics, or CES, preliminary benchmark announcement, and basically showed that Zero Hedge was right on the money. Quote, "For National CES Employment Series, the annual benchmark revisions over the last 10 years have averaged plus or minus 0.1% of total non-farm employment. The preliminary estimate of the benchmark revision indicates an adjustment to March 2024 total non-farm employment of negative 818,000. And including all employment, not just non-farm, the whole shebang had to revise downward 819,000. Zero Hedge reported, "Of course, none of that paints Bidenomics or Kamalanomics or whatever it is now in a flattering picture, because while one can at least pretend that issuing $1 trillion in debt every 100 days to add 3 million jobs per year is somewhat acceptable, learning that that ridiculous amount buys 800,000 jobs less is hardly the endorsement that the White House needs. On the flip side, pretending that the U.S. had added an additional 800,000 jobs in the past year is precisely what Biden and now Kamala would have wanted to generate the kind of buzz and momentum that somehow translates into the greatest economy ever, at least until it is all revised away as the admin's lies finally wash away." Nicole Shanahan, prospective VP candidate for RFK Jr., who himself may or may not still be a candidate by the time you hear this podcast. Shane in post here, he isn't. Sorry, that was way too long. Nicole Shanahan tweeted, "The Bureau of Labor Statistics has long been used as a tool of propaganda by the executive branch. Here's how. They distort definitions, manipulate data, exclude discouraged workers, and revise past reports to generate narratives that fit the agenda of whichever administration is in power. This skews the actual economic picture and misleads citizens about the true state of our economy. It's like a game of musical chairs, and neither side wants to be caught standing when the music stops. The Constitution doesn't grant the government the authority to track unemployment statistics, so why do we even have this agency? Perhaps it's time to get rid of it. Their $750 million budget could surely be put to better use, and private companies already track U.S. employment for free. Win-win. Which is also why you've very likely heard nothing of this report before now. And think about this whenever CNN or MSNBC or whoever tries to gaslight you and say the problems you're experiencing are only an illusion. Look at the statistics. The economy is doing great. Trust us. Well, we can't. And this election is going to pivot on how many people realize it. If you're looking for a way to support this channel, but you don't have any spare cash and you can't stand ads, you can do so by generating your own cryptocurrency. Use the links at the bottom of the description to follow the link to Odysee.com to listen to the podcast and see all of my YouTube videos as well. Just watching videos will produce cryptocurrency for the creator and yourself. And since Odysee is always monetized and never censored, you'll have no problem seeing all the videos from your favorite creators. You can also use the library credits you create at Odysee to tip creators and even purchase paid content. Earn library credits through various rewards, including daily view rewards and the number of shares and invites. And you can interact with creators in all sorts of ways, including like and dislike, comment, boost a post by supporting it, repost it, and share to other sites, all while earning crypto for the creator. Easily monetize yourself and your favorite creators using cryptocurrency without advertising. Use the link below to visit this channel on Odysee.com and see many of your other favorites there as well. And if you really need to know how bad a Harris administration would be, she's 100% behind Biden's 2025 budget proposal, which, among a lot of other horrible things, would, for the first time ever, tax unrealized capital gains. If you buy something and then sell it for more money than you bought it for, the difference is capital gains, and you pay the capital gains tax upon selling it. Unrealized capital gains is that difference before you sell it. In other words, when you don't have the money and whatever it is just sitting there. And that means it's an unconstitutional federal property tax made without apportionment. As it is, it raises the top marginal rate from 37% to 39.6%, the capital gains tax from 20% to 39.6%, and the long-term gains to a whopping 44.6%, the highest rate in U.S. history. And now, a 25% minimum tax on total income, including unrealized capital gains. The total tax hike over American households is $5 trillion. There's no way this passes Congress, and if it does, there's no way it passes muster in the courts. But the main point is that the whole concept of unrealized capital gains is fundamentally bogus, as is the excuse that it only applies to people with a net worth over $100 million, which, even in the best case scenario, is going to drop like a stone as it always does, if inflation doesn't catch up with it first. But consider the following scenario. You go to a thrift shop and buy a painting made by Joe Rando for $50. A few years go by, and your insurance appraiser is looking at your assets. He says, "Didn't you hear? Rando died 8 months ago. His paintings are all the rage now. This painting is worth $160 million. And just like that, overnight, you owe the government $40 million that you don't have because of a $50 purchase that would otherwise be a lucky break. So now you have to pay the tax or suffer Kamala's horrible prison conditions like what she oversaw in California. Your only option is to sell the painting. But can you actually sell it for that $160 million? With people in the interim selling their randos, the price ends up ebbing. And now, with the hype over Rando dying out, you find it difficult to sell it for anywhere near what it was valued. Finally, you manage to sell it for $40 million so you can pay the government and not go to jail. Unrealized gains are only assets on paper, theoretical at best, giving you no economic benefit whatsoever unless and until they're sold. And even if you're not in the situation of buying a lucky painting from an unknown artist who takes off, you're still going to be wanting to finance your car, your house, or anything else, But those asset holders are going to be very careful about things because they don't want to be on the hook for it. And this refers to the dollar value of the appraisals, which may only be going up because of inflation, not any change in real value. So your landlord raises the rent because of increased housing appraisals. Your employer cuts your pay because of increasing values of his assets. And your kid's college tuition goes up because the university holds lots of assets that are appreciating in value. And they all have to pay that tax somehow. And since they don't have the money, since, remember, this isn't actual value they can make use of, they have to pass the costs on to people like you. Whereas the ultra-rich, the ones Kamala says she's going to get the money from, are just going to make loans against their own portfolios so they're not unrealized gains and the interest can be deducted. It's going to fall the hardest on small caps and startups as usual. They'll find it hard to find investors in growing businesses which see greater valuations year over year. That slows their growth, decreases productivity, and makes big corporations even bigger behemoths with even fewer competitors. Back in 2021, Americans were surveyed about this proposal, and 76% of them rejected it, realizing the gains aren't actually gains until they're sold. They view the tax as unfair and a violation of the right to enjoy the fruits of one's labor. Despite denials from the news media, Democratic politicians, and even Harris herself, you need look no further than the White House's fact sheet to confirm all of this. This is what the proposal does, and it is what Kamala supports. Not a conspiracy theory, an actual conspiracy to put the screws on the people and small businesses so Biden, Kamala, and their cronies can be even more enriched. Hopefully people are waking up to it. If you're on the Wi-Fi in a coffee shop or hotel, anyone on that network can get your traffic. Do you really trust all of those strangers? For that matter, do you really trust your ISP? A VPN can protect you from prying eyes, disguise your location, and even foil government censors. It's essential in this day and age, so go to vpn.bogosity.tv and you'll be taken to BoxPN. Starting at just $2.99 a month, you can get unlimited high-speed connections to VPN servers all over the world, and they don't log connections, so your privacy is assured. Traveling abroad, just VPN home, and don't worry about what those other governments are doing. Back at home, stop your ISP from traffic shaping and messing with the quality internet access you're paying good money for. You can connect from multiple machines at once, including your smartphone or tablet, and it supports all the secure standards, including OpenVPN and SSTP. Bypass censors and surveillance with your own secure VPN connection. Go to vpn.bogosity.tv. And here's another thing that people don't often talk about, and that's how much land in the U.S. is actually controlled by the government. In fact, I can't even recall any libertarian presidential candidates talking about it since Harry Brown. But Senator Mike Lee of Utah posted a great thread on X explaining why it's such a problem. But before we get to that, let's talk about the post he was responding to from Utah Governor Spencer J. Cox talking about their case before the Supreme Court. Quote, "The federal government controls 70% of the land in Utah. The U.S. Constitution never intended a federal agency to hold on to so much land in any state. That's why the state of Utah is asking the U.S. Supreme Court to weigh in on this constitutional question we and many Western states have had for years. The relevant part of the Constitution is the Enclave Clause in Article 1, Section 8, Clause 17, which gives the feds power over land, quote, purchased by the consent of the legislature of the state in which the same shall be, for the erection of forts, magazines, arsenals, dockyards, and other needful buildings. It can't own property without permission from the state, and can't just own it for the hell of it either. So the lawsuit is about feds holding unappropriated land. Quote, the unappropriated land in question is approximately 18.5 million acres, or 34% of land in Utah controlled by the Bureau of Land Management. This lawsuit will not impact the millions of appropriated acres already designated as national parks, national monuments, wilderness areas, national forests, tribal lands, or military properties. So Lee explained why this is such a bad thing. Quote, "Not only does this arrangement put Utah's economy in the hands of unelected bureaucrats nearly 2,000 miles away from our state, but it stunts economic growth and leads to poor decision-making, which itself leads to neglect of the land and, in many cases, environmental disaster. We love our public lands in Utah, especially our national parks, but most of our federal land in Utah looks nothing like a national park." This is exactly what Mary Ruwart wrote about in Healing Our World, how the forests owned by paper companies such as Weyerhaeuser are in much better condition and much more well-maintained than ones controlled by the feds. It also violates the state's agreement with the federal government as required by the Enclave Clause. Quote, "Essentially, every state admitted since the Louisiana Purchase, including Utah, was admitted with an understanding that unincorporated land within the state at the moment of statehood would fall into federal lands, but that it, or at least most of it, would later be sold. Utah was promised that 5% of the proceeds from the sale of that land would be put into a trust fund for public education in the state. The U.S. government honored similar commitments with the states added through the Louisiana Purchase and elsewhere. Tragically, these commitments have been neglected with regard to most states in the Rocky Mountains and along the West Coast. It's fundamentally unfair for the U.S. government to control 70% of the land in Utah, while it controls less than 10% of the land in almost every state east of the Rocky Mountains. That puts Utah and other western states on an unequal footing with other states, and the Constitution frowns on that. Just think of what the situation would be if a private company owned all that land. Quote, "If one individual or corporation owned more than 10% of the land in any state, that owner would have an undue and dangerous amount of control over that state's economy and citizens. It'd be exponentially more harmful if that owner controlled a whopping 70% of that state's land. People in that state would be justifiably outraged. Now imagine that, in addition, the individual or corporate owner refused to pay taxes, declaring itself exempt from taxation, and then stingily refused access to most of the land and walled it off from economic activity. Finally, imagine that the owner neglected most of the land it owned, refusing to maintain it properly and leaving it subject to wildfires, floods, and other environmental disasters, harming the interests of adjacent landowners and seriously degrading the environment. So it's both unconstitutional and a breach of their agreement. Aside from the predictable screeching of supposed conservation groups that are really government shills in disguise, it's hard to think of anyone who could possibly think the feds are in the right here. We've been seeing over the years how ridiculous BLM and federal land management has gotten. The whole Bureau needs to go, but that might be a road too far for the Supreme Court. Still, they should see sense that the federal government just isn't allowed to own this much land for absolutely no reason. We'll see how this one goes. Do you have children or nieces or nephews? Are you homeschooling or just want to counter some of the socialist indoctrination most children get in school? If so, go to bogosity.tv/TuttleTwins, and you'll be taken to a website where you can get some great books for elementary-aged children. The Tuttle Twins books are books about liberty and free market economics that include children's versions of Bastiat's The Law, Leonard Read's I, Pencil, and Hayek's The Road to Serfdom, as well as books about the Federal Reserve and how regulations protect business cronies. They'll learn about the harm caused by eminent domain, or regulations passed in the name of safety, and fundamental concepts of liberty. And as you can see from the sample pages on the website, they're all easy to read and nicely illustrated. They're just $9.99 a piece, or get a special discount as well as free bonuses when you purchase all 5. You can even buy in bulk to donate to schools and local libraries. So get the Tuttle Twins books at bogosity.tv/TuttleTwins. And now it's time to insolubilize this week's biggest bogon emitter. Not even president yet, and she's already taking it on. Kamala Harris is proving that the secret to success in politics is good relations with the common folk. And if you can fake that, you've got it made. Apparently, the normies dining in a Pittsburgh restaurant just weren't satisfactory to Kamala and her videographers. Patrons of Primanti Brothers were enjoying what I'm sure was a nice meal on a Saturday, enjoying food, beer, and football, when all of a sudden they were told to leave because the Veep was coming. Patron Mark Dodson said, quote, "I wanted to watch some sports and enjoy an afternoon lunch. Around 3:30, the bartender, she goes, 'It's last call.' 'What do you mean last call?' And they did possibly the worst thing you could do to the common man in this country. Turn off the sports." Quote, "They shut down the TVs so you couldn't watch the game. I said, this is BS. This is a public restaurant." It was kind of mind-boggling to me. They soon got their answer in the form of a whole convoy, which included not only the Veep's campaign bus, but a whole processional of vans full of hired patrons for her to interact with. A local ABC News affiliate broadcaster stopped in Primanti Brothers, showing her going from table to table where the fake patrons gushed over her and thanked her for the wonderful job she's doing. They also didn't seem to be doing much eating. And according to reports, they weren't dressed like normal Saturday afternoon patrons, wearing dress shirts and nice dresses and pantsuits. No t-shirts or blue jeans in sight. I guess she was afraid she wouldn't have gotten the same reception from the real patrons, which might be the case because they started a protest outside the restaurant and a lot of them were wearing Donald Trump gear. A group of Trump supporters soon showed up waving signs and banners. Many of them shouted out that they'd been kicked out of the restaurant and the people inside were all paid actors. Keep in mind, these weren't like deadheads following their favorite band around, hoping to get a selfie with their hero. You can see the video of all of the identical white vans convoying in after the real patrons were kicked out. Harris has also been taking additional measures, such as requiring rally attendees to present photo IDs. And another obviously scripted video emerged of her and Tim Walz in a Sheetz convenience store talking about corn nuts from across the aisle while Walz tosses her a bag of Doritos. It was the second take, apparently. Jack Posobiec somehow got the whole unedited video, possibly cell footage from a customer since it's from a different angle, and posted it to X. Sharp-eyed viewers had already pointed out that her husband was still holding the bag of Doritos from the first take. Worst things worst, Kamala apparently forgot that her administration is suing Sheetz for requiring criminal background checks of employees, which she says is racist. The videos are faked, the support is faked. And she's hoping that'll translate into real support, as opposed to, actually talking to people and telling them her policies. But we heard earlier an example of that, so maybe this is the best way forward for her. So all of that makes Kamala Harris this week's biggest bogon emitter. I want to tell you about the eyeglasses I've been wearing for years. As people can see on my videos, I have a very strong prescription, which makes glasses more expensive, especially when I need computer glasses, reading glasses, prescription sunglasses, and most expensively, progressive lenses for general everyday wear. To save money while still getting quality glasses, I get them from Firmoo. In fact, I just got a pair of progressives with high-index aspherical lenses and a nice pair of frames my wife loves for just over $100. It would have been $500 to get them through my eye doctor. Not only do they look good, the glasses are durable. I've worn many pairs for several years without problems. All orders come with a 30-day return policy, a 3-month warranty, and one-on-one customer service. Go to Firmoo, that's FIRMOO.Pagosity.tv anytime you need quality glasses at a low price. Once again, that's Firmoo.Pagosity.tv. And now let's over-fertilize this week's Idiot Extraordinaire. And this week it goes to the Boston Globe, which just posted the absolutely insane and astoundingly economically ignorant claim that Harris's price controls are good economics. They wrote, "The idea that prices serve to balance supply and demand and should be left free to do so is bred in the bone of economists, so much so that facts barely matter." I mean, seriously? You're going to deny basic supply and demand and then say that other people are ignorant of economics? There's just weird stuff like, quote, U.S. egg production peaked in 2019 and then fell slightly through last year. Egg prices spiked from early 2022 to $4.82 a dozen on average in January 2023 before falling back again with no gain in production. High prices did not stimulate America's hens to greater effort. And if that isn't dumb enough, they debunk their own thesis. Quote, egg prices surged because costs did. Production then dropped again, partly due to avian flu. It has since begun to recover. When feed and fuel prices receded in 2023, egg prices came back down. Wait a minute, they came back down? But I thought corporations were all greedy and wouldn't do that, and that's why we need Kamala's price controls. Listen to them talk around it. Quote, most businesses most of the time are like the honest egg farmer, but some do gouge the public some of the time. Companies that use eggs have invested heavily in branding, packaging, and ads to distinguish their mayonnaise or pasta from the field. When the price of eggs goes up, those firms take price, as they say on their earnings calls, meaning they jump on the chance to raise prices and count on their competitors to do the same so that everyone can protect their margins. But when egg prices fall, they are in no rush to bring prices down, and so they reap a windfall. Well, that would rather depend on what the new production line is like, right? I mean, they didn't just up the price and then keep on just like they were before, you know. Or do you? They go on like that with things that wouldn't flummox a first semester econ student, pretending like they aren't easily explained by supply and demand. Quote, most of the time price gouges are exceptional and can be dealt with case by case, but there are moments when gouging becomes the rule. If basic costs spike, as they did in 2021 to 2022, business plans are disrupted, uncertainty and fear take hold. Some businesses will react by raising their margins because they can without sticking out. What happened in 2021 and 2022 was inflation. It wasn't anything about the supply of goods, but the supply of dollars. More dollars chasing fewer goods and services. Something else that wouldn't puzzle a first-year econ student. Look at the margins for the very companies Kamala is talking about. Kroger's profit margin as of April of this year is 1.43%. Albertsons, as of May, is 1.41%. Walmart's is 2.34% as of July. Now think about this. Any of those stores or their investors could instead have put their money into one-year treasury bills and made over 5%, over double what they did over the past year. They made far less money than they could have, so you and I could have food to eat. So how is this in any way price gouging? And it's funny that he looks at JFK for support when JFK never actually instituted price controls, but ignores Richard Nixon and the disastrous decade his price controls led to. They close out with, Harris's policy is popular. That is a sign that Americans still have some common sense. That is a good thing. It shows that all of the efforts of free market economists to beat it out of them have not yet worked. So, appeal to popularity, appeal to common sense, poisoning the well, and an ad hominem attack. Nice. Way to show your true colors. Of course, it's not popular, and it's far from anything that could be called any sort of sense. But I guess that's just what you have to do when the facts don't go your way. So all of that makes the Boston Globe this week's
Idiot extraordinaire!
Well, that wraps up this I Made Some Cocoa and Got Engaged edition of the Bogosity Podcast. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, please go to donate.bogosity.tv for several ways to support and discord.bogosity.tv to join the discussion. Subscribe at the Discord or at Patreon or Subscribestar, and you can listen early and ad-free. Thank you for listening. Remember, no podcast next week, so until next time, here's a quote from Bertrand Russell. The fundamental cause of the trouble is that in the modern world, the stupid are cocksure, while the intelligent are full of doubt. The Bogosity Podcast is licensed under Creative Commons Attribution Non-Commercial No Derivatives 4.0 International License.
Bogosity.